I'm sure every one of you guys this year and last has heard tons nonstop about the Magnificent Seven, coming off of the 2023 lows and absolutely ripping to new highs. These are the largest companies in the world, and today I wanted to talk about one that I think is the closest to fair value and could offer some great returns going forward, and that is Google. As you guys can see, Google's stock chart here has been absolutely phenomenal, going up and up continually, having some dips and things along the way, coming off of the lows in late 2022, early 2023. They're just barely making new highs here as well from the highs in 2021. And we're going to be diving more into the details of this company, what value it could provide. As you can see right off the bat, it has done very well up until now. Google is one of those companies that has become absolutely integrated with honestly everything that we do. I mean, Google itself is a verb. If you're trying to look something up, you go Google it. Even if you're actually not using Google at all, that tells you a little bit of what you need to know when it comes to how big of a player Google is. But we're actually going to be diving into the details of the company itself, and it may actually be even more dominant in some areas than you think, and that can be a great benefit, but also provide a little bit of context of what its future could look like if it's already the biggest player in the world. What more does it have to grow? We'll get more into that later. Alphabet itself, which is the parent company of Google, engages in the business of delivering online advertising, cloud-based solutions that provide enterprise customers with infrastructure and platform services. The provision of communication and collaboration tools and the sales of other products, services such as apps and in-app purchases, hardware, and subscription-based products. They do a ton here, but their bread and butter is really online advertising through their search engine, Google itself, as well as YouTube. They were founded in 1998 and IPO'd in 2004. Very interesting for me to see how quickly they actually IPO'd after being founded. In their most recent report, they obviously broke down their total year revenue for 2023, and I wanted to share with you guys where their revenue actually comes from here. You can see their Google search and other, they had about $175 billion that came in from that source alone. They also have different ways of advertising, like through YouTube. They also utilize their Google network, and this totals into their advertising of $237 billion is what they generated in 2023 from advertising itself. You can see their other areas like Google subscriptions, platforms, and devices generated $34 billion. And this in turn shows you how big their advertising is of their total revenues here. They really rely heavily on that advertising through their Google search itself, along with YouTube, with search being the bigger player there. You can see their cloud here has grown from 2022, and they have other bets as well that have actually grown 50% here. We weren't going to touch on them today, but they're certainly a cherry on top. We'll be focusing more on their advertising through their search, which is their main driver of growth right now and their main source of revenue and cash generation. Anytime that I'm going over a company, I want to understand their debt situation, and for Google, it is very simple. You can see their net debt that I have pulled up here through Stock Unlock. Their net debt, their latest report totals negative almost $100 billion. This means after taking their debt and subtracting how much cash they have, they come up with a negative $100 billion, meaning they could pay off all their debt with cash on hand and still have $100 billion. There's absolutely no concern here from me. On their balance sheet, they are as clean as a company could ever get, so I'm not even going to go into the details. I wanted to compare Google to some of the other Magnificent Seven companies that are the most relatable to what they do, and we're going to be comparing a few different financial metrics. Currently, their free cash flow margin in comparison with Apple, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft. You can see their latest of each of these companies. For Apple, sat around 27.7, Amazon, the lowest at 5.6%, Google around 22.6%, Meta 32.5%, and Microsoft 29.6%. Google actually sits at the second lowest, but this is in comparison with some of the most profitable companies in the world. So take that with a grain of salt, but it's interesting to see how they compare here. Maybe tells you why it might be the closest to fair value right now, sitting at maybe one of the lower end of the free cash flow margin. Although you can see their high watermarks that they've each set, Google actually sits right in the middle of all these companies, with Microsoft and Meta both being higher, and their median sitting pretty much right in line with where they're currently at, 22%, and is about the same where everyone falls. Keep in mind, Amazon does much higher revenue than all of these companies, but their margin is much lower, so gives you a little bit of perspective there. Currently, this is one of the biggest metrics that I'm looking at right now, is their price to free cash flow. You can see Google sits at about 23.5, and Apple is next closest at 24.5. Looking at Microsoft and Amazon are really high, in the 50s and 44 for Microsoft. Tells me that Apple and Google are the closest to being fairly valued, and Google right now obviously sitting the lowest. Next, let's look on return on assets. This tells you how much money the company is able to earn in comparison to the total assets that they have. What percent of profit do they have coming in to their current assets? You can see that Apple is the highest at 28%. Google is the next at 18%, followed by Microsoft, Meta, and lastly, Amazon. The next, looking at revenue, we're not going to compare actual numbers, but just look at the cumulative average growth rate. Tells you a little bit about how these companies are growing. You have Google sitting at 17.65%, Amazon sitting at 20.02%. You can see how the other companies fall here. It just lets you know Google is still growing very significantly. And it's interesting to see that these companies, although they're some of the largest in the world, actually are growing very well. And I think it's due to their dominant positions in their respective industries, which we'll touch more on later. When it comes to their net margin, looking here from top to bottom, Apple sits at 26%, Amazon again in the 5s, Google sitting at 24%, Meta at 28%, and Microsoft at 36%. Again, all of these companies, excluding Amazon, have extremely strong margins, which is really interesting to see. But Google, again, even though it may not be the highest, it still is a very strong position. Next, I want to spend time on the risks and the tailwinds that Google actually has, kind of weighing a little bit of the bull in the bear case. We'll go over more details there, and hopefully you guys find this valuable. I know that I did, doing all this work for you guys and putting everything together in something that I hope is easy to understand. Currently on the screen, you guys see a chart which indicates market share of search for Google. You can see since 2015, it has never dropped below 93% and has sat just below 97 with maybe a slight trend upwards. But guys, Google has around a 95% market share in search. They currently sit at 95.32% of the global mobile search engine market worldwide. That is absolutely insane. When you consider how dominant Google is in this space, any company that you could ever think of, if they controlled 95% of their respective market, not just in their country, but in the world, Google operates as a monopoly. Flat out controlling 95% of the search market worldwide. It's really crazy when you put it in perspective like that. The reason that I actually have this listed in the risks category for Google is it lets you know they don't really have much more room to grow when you're looking at the current market share. And really the only thing for them to do is actually go down or maintain. There's not a lot of opportunity for growth here. They've kind of hit a ceiling, but it tells you they are in a dominant position. But in my mind, it actually kind of looks more of a risk for them of losing that position, even if it's only 5 to 10 percentage points of market share. That's really one of the only directions they have to go. Over the past couple years, there's been some major developments in a little thing, maybe you guys haven't heard of it before, ChatGPT. Obviously, it has blown up, taken the world by absolute storm. And these large language models that are being trained, I think, do provide some competition for Google, along with Microsoft really trying to integrate AI into Bing. I think that provides some serious competition for Google and is very real in putting pressure on their ability to maintain their current market share. Even if Google is able to maintain their current market share, I think that increased competition is going to force them to potentially decrease costs on their advertising, which is going to put downward pressure on their margins just because of the increased competition. If they want to maintain their place in line as the dominant player, I think that they're going to have to stay competitive as these AI large language models continue to get better and better, and as Microsoft really tries to push Bing to be a mainstream competitor, although it's certainly not there yet. There is some, and I think it was important to watch out for. But remember, Google still sits at 95% of market share. Now let's dive into the tailwinds for Google that I think could be drivers of growth for them in the next decade. First off, let's take a look at the worldwide digital population that connects to the internet. As of January 2024, there were 5.35 billion internet users worldwide, which amounted to about 66.2% of the global population. This lets you know that even though they've hit their max market share, the market itself is still growing. Probably not at an astronomical rate, but it is still going to be growing. People in underdeveloped nations are still going to be connecting, and they're going to be using Google. Google is the dominant player there. It's very natural for them to go there, especially with them being on all Samsung devices integrated there as well. I think Samsung is a little bit more competitive when it comes to developing nations just because they don't have the same premium on their phones or their devices that Apple does. Google also, in comparing this along with Apple, again, I think Google has a good ecosystem, which does have some capture for people. I don't think it's near as strong as Apple's. When you integrate something with Apple, everything ideally connects seamlessly, and I think they do a great job of that. Google, I think, has some of the same things. It makes it difficult for people to really leave the ecosystem, so they have some capture there, and I think that is going to be a really good aid in them being able to maintain, maybe with a little bit of growth in their market share. One of the other things that I absolutely love about YouTube is their position with YouTube. YouTube is absolutely gigantic, and I don't think I gave it the credit it deserved until I actually looked into how big it really was. Below here, you guys can see YouTube has 2.7 billion users. Facebook is the only one larger, sitting at just over 3 billion, but it really tells you YouTube sits at the second most used social media platform in the world. Although it may not feel like it, YouTube is pretty much a monopoly on its own of long-form content. There's not really any of these other platforms that even compete at all. All of them have to do with short form. YouTube is another monopoly in itself, and I see this one with almost no competition coming in the pipeline. It really will sit at a dominant position, I think, for the coming decade or few, and I think it's a phenomenal position for Google. Even if their search is under pressure, I don't think it's going to make up for it 100%, but it is a great tailwind for them to have a solid foundation. So to review what we've gone over so far, Google does have a serious risk of losing market share in search to competitors, but I still think it maintains a dominant position with some ecosystem capture that keeps people there. Has a fantastic position in social media with YouTube as well. And Google also maintains very high margins across the board, is a cash generating machine, and has an incredibly strong balance sheet. So that gives you an idea of up to now some of the things that we've talked about, some of the bear cases in other companies, large language models, Microsoft, having some serious competition with Google that could drive down their margins, could cause them to lose market share, along with the bull case of the digital market is actually still growing, and they are the dominant player to continue to capture that as people come in. They have a fantastic balance sheet continue generating monstrous amounts of cash. They still have a great position in YouTube that I think is not going away anytime soon. So kind of gives you a little bit to weigh. I do think the risk is probably a little bit higher than the current tailwinds that they have. The tailwinds really allow them just to kind of melt upwards. There's no explosive growth coming from that. It allows them to just kind of maintain their position, albeit their position is currently the strongest in the internet world at 95% market share. After reviewing all that information, let's dive into a discounted free cash flow valuation model. We're going to be looking at a discounted free cash flow model over the next 5 years. And first off, I'm actually just going to assume zero growth, no change in shares outstanding, only a price ratio of about 24, which is I think where a fair price sits for them. This is much higher than I would assume for other companies, but they operate as a monopoly, and I think it's worth paying a much higher price for them. And this is a fair price. I think they're going to go above and below this. This puts us at a fair value to generate 10% returns at around $83 a share, which is currently 38% below where they currently sit. Now, on the low end, if we were to assume a 4% growth rate in their free cash flow and a negative 2% growth in their shares outstanding, which is what they've done over the past 5 years, they've got an absolute crazy amount of cash, and I think they'll continue doing that. If we just make those assumptions, trying to get a 10% return, the fair value sits at $112, currently 17% below where they are. If we assume an 8% growth rate in their free cash flow, you can see that their fair value sits almost exactly where we are at right now. So this does tell you one thing, that the market is assuming about an 8% growth rate. Right now, from their current price, that gives you a 10% cumulative average growth rate over the next 5 years. Let's look at a 12% growth rate. This puts us at a fair value of $162, 20% above where they currently sit right now. Now that you guys have all the information that I've gone through today about what Google is as a company, what position they currently have in the market, what their prospects look like going forward, competition, margin pressure, all these different kinds of things, let's dive into kind of my final thoughts and where I see Google sitting at. Keep in mind, this is not advice. Go out, do your own research. I put a ton of time into these to really understand not only company, but my prospects for them going forward, what I think their fair value sits at. So with that, again, do your own research, and let's dive into my final thoughts. Overall, my view on Google is they are an absolutely fantastic company. They do have a good future, although it is currently being muddied by potential competition from large language models and Microsoft really pushing Bing, integrating AI. That's kind of the same story all in one. That is a really big story for them going forward. I do think YouTube, as I said before, will remain very dominant in their current position. I see that going absolutely nowhere. So that is a really good sign for me. Even if you're just looking at YouTube itself, I think that has decades and decades in front of it. If Google can get back to really being a driver of innovation and investing heavily into that, I think that they can continue to not only maintain their position, but potentially drive further growth. Even if it's not in their search and their advertising, they've got so much cash. I think that they could find other ways using AI to drive efficiencies for other companies, along with growing their cloud, their other bets and things that they have going on. I think that as long as they deploy that capital well, then they can continue to maintain their position and have respectable growth going forward. Again, I don't know that we're going to see explosive growth from Google, but just maintaining alone means this is one of the best companies in the world. So overall, I currently have a current watch price of around $120. That's at the price that I would at least start taking a look again at the full picture, make sure nothing has changed, and start a very small position. The reason I want to only start a small position there is if things start to go wrong and Google loses market share, I think that things could crumble, at least when it comes to their stock price, very quickly. I think it's very easy to look and say they could fall by 50%, maybe even more. And so I would only be looking at starting a small position. And if it goes up from there, fantastic. I'm totally fine with that. But if it continues to fall, I want to make sure I'm in a really good spot to add a lot more. Because I think even if, for example, Google were to lose 10, 15% market share, that's not going to be a company destroyer for them. I think it obviously is very negative, but I don't think it's going to destroy their model at all. Now, that's assuming nothing else has changed and it's clear that Google isn't going anywhere anytime soon. As long as that stays the same, which I think it would be very hard to change, then I would certainly be looking at buying more, especially if it fell 50%. But that gives you guys an idea of what my thoughts are. Again, this is not advice. Go out and do your own work. But hopefully this was valuable for you guys, and I will see you in the next one.